The morning sun peeked through the dusty windows of Harold Thompson's small house on Pine Street. At 93 years old, Harold lived alone in the quiet town of Pine Grove, Montana. His house wasn't fancy, just a simple two-bedroom home with faded blue paint and a small garden that had seen better days. But to Harold, it was his castle, filled with memories of a life well lived. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., Harold would start his daily routine. His wrinkled hands would carefully button up his favorite checkered shirt, the one his daughter Sarah had given him last Christmas. He would polish his old brown shoes until they shined, just like he had learned to do in the army many years ago. The last and most important part of his morning ritual was placing his veteran's cap on his head. The cap was special. It wasn't just any hat, but a symbol of his service as a combat medic in World War II. Looking in the mirror, Harold saw both the young soldier he once was and the old man he had become. His face was lined with wrinkles, each one telling a story of joy, sorrow, or sacrifice. His blue eyes, though now a bit cloudy with age, still held the same determination that had helped him save countless lives on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. At 8 o'clock a.m. sharp, Harold would begin his 3-block walk to Joe's Diner. He walked slowly but steadily, using his wooden cane for support. The cane had been carved by his late wife, Martha, who had passed away 5 years ago. As he walked, Harold would greet everyone he met. Mrs. Chen watering her flowers, Mr. Rodriguez opening his small grocery store, and the Wilson kids waiting for their school bus. Joe's Diner was more than just a place to eat for Harold. It was where he felt connected to the world. The red and chrome building hadn't changed much since it opened in 1955. The bell above the door would ring as Harold pushed it open, and Sally, the friendly waitress with graying hair and kind eyes, would call out, "Morning, Mr. Thompson." The usual? Harold would sit at his regular spot, the third booth from the door, where he could see both the street and the kitchen. He always ordered the same breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with a little butter, crispy bacon, and black coffee. While he ate, he would solve the daily crossword puzzle from the Pine Grove Gazette, using the same blue pen he'd carried in his shirt pocket for the past decade. Other regular customers at Joe's knew Harold's story. They knew he had served as a combat medic in the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. They knew he had earned a Silver Star for bravery under fire, saving 16 soldiers during the D-Day invasion. But Harold never talked about these things unless someone asked. He was a humble man who believed that doing good was its own reward. In his wallet, Harold carried old photographs that were worn at the edges from years of handling. There was one of him and Martha on their wedding day in 1947, another of their 3 children growing up, and a faded picture of his military unit standing before a French village they had helped liberate. Sometimes, while waiting for his breakfast, he would take out these photos and remember the people and places that had shaped his life. The townspeople respected Harold. Parents would tell their children, "That's Mr. Thompson. He's a real hero." Young veterans who came to the diner would sometimes sit with him, sharing stories and seeking advice. Harold would listen carefully to their struggles, understanding the challenges of returning to civilian life better than most. His routine was simple, but it gave him purpose. Each morning, walk to Joe's Diner was his way of telling the world that he was still here, still independent, still living life on his own terms. Little did Harold know that his peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his courage in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. The peaceful life Harold Thompson had known for decades changed on a warm Monday morning in June. As he walked his usual route to Joe's Diner, the sound of rumbling motorcycles filled the quiet street. The old brick building across from the diner, which had been empty for years, now had a fresh coat of black paint and a large sign that read "Dead Ravens Motorcycle Club." Harold watched as 5 motorcycles pulled up to the building. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets with ravens on the back, their boots heavy on the sidewalk as they walked. They looked rough and unfriendly, with long beards and tattoos covering their arms. The oldest one seemed to be in his 50s, while the youngest couldn't have been more than 25. At first, Harold tried to convince himself that nothing would change. He kept to his routine, walking past the clubhouse each morning. But soon, he noticed the younger bikers watching him, their eyes following his slow progress down the street. They would lean against their motorcycles, talking in low voices and laughing as he passed by. One of them, a tall man with spiky red hair who everyone called Razor, started making comments just loud enough for Harold to hear. "Look at Grandpa, still playing soldier," he would say, or "Better hurry up, old-timer, before your legs give out." His friends would laugh, encouraging him to say more hurtful things. Sally, the waitress at Joe's diner, noticed the change in Harold. His shoulders were more hunched than usual, and he didn't smile as much when she brought his morning coffee. "Those troublemakers bothering you, Mr. Thompson?" she asked one morning, worry clear in her voice. But Harold just shook his head and opened his newspaper, pretending to read while his hands trembled slightly. The situation got worse when more bikers started showing up early in the morning. They would park their motorcycles in ways that made it hard for Harold to pass on the sidewalk. Sometimes he had to step onto the road to get around them, which was dangerous for a man his age. His daughter Sarah noticed his anxiety during her weekly visits and suggested he try a different route to the diner, but Harold refused. "I've been walking this way for 20 years, he said firmly. "I won't let anyone chase me away." The other business owners on the street were also worried. Mr. Rodriguez from the grocery store tried talking to the police, but since the bikers hadn't actually broken any laws, there wasn't much they could do. Mrs. Chen stopped watering her flowers when the bikers were around, and the Wilson kids now waited for their school bus on a different corner. One morning, Harold overheard two of the younger bikers talking about their leader, a man they called Steele Morrison. They spoke about him with respect and fear, mentioning how he had started the Dead Ravens 30 years ago. Harold listened carefully, storing this information away like he used to do during the war when every detail could be important. The harassment continued in small ways that were hard to prove but easy to feel. The bikers would rev their engines extra loud when Harold passed by. They would block the entrance to Joe's diner, forcing him to squeeze past them. Sometimes they would blow cigarette smoke in his direction, knowing it made him cough. Through it all, Harold maintained his dignity. He never showed anger, never complained to the police, and never changed his schedule. He remembered facing much worse dangers during the war, though the emotional pain of being disrespected hurt in a different way than physical wounds. At night, lying in his bed, Harold would look at his old military photos and think about how much the world had changed. In his day, there had been a code of honor, even among enemies. These young bikers seemed to have no respect for anything, especially not for an old veteran who had fought for their freedom to live as they pleased. Little did Harold know that the worst was yet to come, and soon he would face a moment that would test not just his courage, but his very understanding of human nature. Dark clouds hung over Pine Grove on a Thursday morning in late June. The weather forecast had predicted rain, but Harold Thompson didn't own an umbrella. He hadn't needed one since Martha passed away. She was always the one who insisted on carrying one. So when the first drops began to fall, Harold simply pulled his veteran's cap lower over his eyes and continued his walk to Joe's diner. The cap was special to him. Martha had given it to him on their last wedding anniversary together, 5 years ago. She had saved up for months to buy it, ordering it specially with his unit number and medals properly displayed. "So everyone can see what a hero you are," she had said, her eyes twinkling. Harold touched the cap gently, feeling the familiar stitching under his fingers. The rain grew heavier as Harold approached the Dead Ravens clubhouse. Usually, the bad weather kept most of the bikers away, but today was different. Razor and his friend Snake were there, standing under the clubhouse awning, drinking coffee and looking bored. When they spotted Harold, their faces lit up with mean smiles. "Well, look who it is," Razor called out, nudging Snake. "The old soldier doesn't know enough to come in out of the rain." They both laughed, but this time they didn't just watch Harold pass by. Instead, they walked to their motorcycles, which were parked on either side of the narrow sidewalk. Harold could see what they were planning. The bikes were positioned so close together that there was barely enough space for a person to squeeze through. On a normal day, it would have been difficult enough, but with the rain making the ground slippery, it was downright dangerous for someone Harold's age. "Excuse me," Harold said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the sound of falling rain. "Could you please move one of the bikes? It's not safe in this weather." Razor pretended not to hear him. "What's that, old-timer? Speak up. All those explosions in the war must have damaged your hearing." Snake laughed so hard at this that he spilled some of his coffee. Harold looked around. The street was empty. Everyone else had enough sense to stay inside during the downpour. The only other person he could see was Sally, watching worriedly through Joe's diner window. She made a motion like she was going to come out to help, but Harold shook his head slightly. He didn't want her getting into trouble on his account. Taking a deep breath, Harold began to edge sideways between the motorcycles. His shoes slipped slightly on the wet concrete, and he had to move very carefully. The rain was running down his neck now, soaking through his jacket. His cane didn't help much on the slick surface. Just as he was halfway through, Snake accidentally bumped his motorcycle. The bike shifted just enough to force Harold to step back. His foot landed in a deep puddle that had formed between the sidewalk and the street. The sudden step made him lose his balance. Harold's cane slipped, and he stumbled forward. As he reached out to steady himself, his precious veteran's cap fell from his head. Time seemed to slow down as Harold watched the cap fall. It landed in the puddle with a small splash, water immediately soaking into the fabric. The sound of Razor and Snake's laughter echoed off the buildings. "Looks like the soldiers finally falling out of formation." Razor called out, making Snake laugh even harder. They'd high-fived each other, clearly proud of what they'd done. Harold stood there in the rain, his clothes soaked, staring at his cap floating in the dirty water. For the first time since the war, he felt truly helpless. It wasn't the fall that hurt. He had managed to catch himself before going down completely. It wasn't even the wet clothes or the laughter. It was seeing Martha's last gift to him lying there in the mud. With shaking hands, Harold picked up his cap. Water dripped from its brim, and the once proud emblem was smeared with street crime. As he held it, something inside the old veteran changed. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by something else, a look that hadn't been there since his days on Omaha Beach. It was the look of a man who had made a decision. What happened next would surprise everyone in Pine Grove, especially the dead Ravens, because Harold Thompson was about to make a choice that nobody, not even he himself, could have expected. Harold Thompson sat at his kitchen table that rainy afternoon, his wet clothes changed for dry ones, but his heart still heavy. In front of him lay his veteran's cap, now cleaned as best he could manage. The mud had mostly washed away, but the cap would never look quite the same. As he carefully dabbed at it with a soft cloth, he noticed something unusual, a small tear in the inner lining. Using his reading glasses and the bright lamp from his desk, Harold examined the tear more closely. There was something tucked inside the lining, something that shouldn't have been there. With trembling fingers, he carefully worked the hidden object out. It was an old photograph, one he had completely forgotten about. The photograph was small and slightly yellow with age, its edges worn soft from years hidden in the cap. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he looked at it. The picture showed a much younger version of himself, dressed in his combat medic uniform, kneeling beside a wounded soldier on a beach strewn with debris. It was D-Day, June 6, 1944, on Omaha Beach. Harold remembered that day as clearly as if it were yesterday. The soldier in the photograph had been badly wounded by German machine gun fire. Harold had spent 3 hours with him, stopping the bleeding and keeping him alive while bullets flew over their heads. The soldier's name had been James Morrison. His hand started shaking as a memory clicked into place. Last week, he had overheard the younger bikers talking about their leader, Steele Morrison, who had started the Dead Ravens 30 years ago. They had mentioned that Steele's father had fought in World War II and had nearly died on D-Day, saved only by a combat medic whose name he never learned. Harold stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked to his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, where he kept his war memorabilia. Inside a small box, he found his old medical logbook. His fingers, stiff with arthritis but driven by purpose, flipped through the pages until he found the entry for June 6, 1944. There it was, written in his own handwriting, now faded but still readable. James Morrison, 29 years old. Multiple gunshot wounds to right leg and abdomen. Treated under heavy fire behind disabled Sherman tank. Patient stabilized and evacuated to medical ship, expected to survive. Harold sat on his bed, the logbook in one hand and the photograph in the other, as the pieces fell into place. The man he had saved that day on Omaha Beach was Steele Morrison's father, the leader of the Dead Ravens, the man whose club members had been making Harold's life miserable, owed his very existence to Harold's actions that day. Moving back to his study, Harold pulled out his old military trunk. Inside, he found more photographs from the war, his medical kit, still stained with sand from Omaha Beach, and the Silver Star medal he had received for his actions that day. Each item brought back vivid memories of the war, of the lives he had saved, and of the brothers he had lost. As the afternoon turned to evening, Harold sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the rain continue to fall. The discovery had stirred something in him, not anger at the bikers' treatment of him, but a deep understanding that life had a way of connecting people in the most unexpected ways. He thought about James Morrison, wondering if he had told his son about the unnamed medic who saved his life that bloody morning in France. Harold looked at his reflection in the window, seeing not the tired old man who had been bullied that morning, but the young combat medic who had never hesitated to help others, even under the worst conditions. A plan began to form in his mind. It was risky, perhaps even foolish, but Harold knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, instead of his usual walk to Joe's diner, he would take a different path. He would walk straight into the Dead Ravens clubhouse, carrying his medical kit and the photograph. It was time to remind everyone, including himself, that courage came in many forms, and that the bonds forged in war could bridge even the widest of gaps. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself wanted to witness what was about to happen. Harold Thompson woke up earlier than usual, his mind already clear about what he needed to do. He dressed with extra care, putting on his best shirt, the crisp blue one he usually saved for church, and polished his shoes until they shined like mirrors. Instead of his damaged veteran's cap, he placed his Silver Star medal on his shirt pocket. From his military trunk, he took out his old medical kit, still carrying the scent of canvas and antiseptic after all these years. The photograph of him saving James Morrison and his medical logbook went into the kit's side pocket. Sally nearly dropped her coffee pot when she saw Harold walk past Joe's diner without coming in. "Mr. Thompson?" she called out, but Harold just gave her a small wave and a reassuring smile. You could see the worry in her face as she watched him head straight for the Dead Ravens clubhouse. The morning crowd of bikers was already gathering outside the clubhouse. Razor and Snake were there, along with about 15 other members. They fell silent as Harold approached, surprised to see him walking toward them instead of trying to avoid them as usual. Harold's heart was beating fast, but his steps were steady. He remembered feeling the same way on D-Day, walking into danger because it was the right thing to do. The bikers parted in front of him, too confused by his approach to make their usual comments. At the clubhouse door, a large man with a beard blocked Harold's path. "This is private property, old man," he growled. "Members only." Harold looked up at him, his blue eyes clear and determined. "I need to speak with Steele Morrison," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "It's about his father, James Morrison." The name caused a stir among the bikers. The bearded man spoke into a radio clipped to his vest, and a few minutes later, the clubhouse door opened. Steele Morrison himself stepped out, a tall man in his 50s with gray streaks in his dark hair and a face that had seen its share of fights. "Who are you?" Steele asked, his voice deep and suspicious. "How do you know my father's name?" Harold opened his medical kit and carefully took out the photograph. "My name is Harold Thompson," he said, holding out the picture. "I was a combat medic with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division. On June 6, 1944, I spent 3 hours under enemy fire on Omaha Beach, keeping your father alive." The silence that followed was complete. Even the morning traffic seemed to pause. Steele took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, his tough exterior cracking as he recognized his father's young face. "All my life," Steele said, his voice rough with emotion, "my father told me about the medic who saved him. He said he owed everything to this man who wouldn't leave him, even when the bullets were flying. He said that medic was the bravest person he'd ever met." Harold pulled out his logbook and showed Steele the entry about James Morrison. As the biker leader read his father's name in the faded handwriting, his eyes grew wet. The other Dead Ravens gathered around, all pretense of toughness forgotten as they witnessed this moment. "Dad tried to find you after the war," Steele said, looking up from the logbook. "He wanted to thank you, but he never knew your name. He died 10 years ago, still telling that story." The morning sun caught Harold's Silver Star, making it shine. Some of the younger bikers, including Razor and Snake, shifted uncomfortably as they realized who they had been tormenting. This wasn't just any old veteran. This was the man their leader's father had spoken about with awe. Harold stood straight, looking every inch the hero he had been and still was. "Your father was a brave man," he said. "He never gave up, even when things looked hopeless. He reminded me of why we were fighting that day, not just for ourselves, but for the future." What happened next would change everything, not just for Harold and the dead ravens, but for the entire town of Pine Grove. The morning sun climbed higher over the dead ravens' clubhouse as Steele Morrison wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The tough biker leader who had never shown weakness in front of his club was crying openly now. He held the old photograph of Harold saving his father as if it were made of gold. "Please," Steele said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Come inside. I want you to see something." He gestured toward the clubhouse door. The other bikers moved aside, forming a respectful path for Harold to walk through. Razor and Snake, who had bullied Harold just yesterday, couldn't even look him in the eye. Inside the clubhouse, the main room was filled with motorcycles parts, leather jackets, and club memorabilia. But Steele led Harold to a special corner where a large framed photo hung on the wall. It showed an older man sitting on a vintage motorcycle, smiling at the camera. "That's my father," Steele said, "James Morrison, 10 years ago, just before he passed away." Harold stepped closer to the picture, seeing the same features he remembered from that terrible day on Omaha Beach, now aged but still recognizable. Below the photograph was a small display case containing military items, dog tags, a few medals, and a piece of shrapnel the doctors had removed from James's leg. "Dad made me promise to keep these things here," Steele explained, opening the display case. He said they reminded him of what real courage looked like. Steele carefully took out an old, wrinkled piece of paper and handed it to Harold. It was a letter James had written before he died. Harold's hands shook as he read the letter. In it, James described how a young medic had saved his life on D-Day. He wrote about lying wounded on the beach, certain he was going to die, when this brave medic crawled through heavy gunfire to reach him. The medic had stayed with him for 3 hours, using his own body to shield James from bullets, talking to him about home to keep him conscious while treating his wounds. "My father said that day changed him forever," Steele continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He said he lived every day trying to be as brave as that medic. That's why he started this motorcycle club, to create a brotherhood like the one he experienced in the war. He wanted to help people, just like you helped him." The other bikers gathered around as Steele spoke, listening intently. Many of them had never heard the full story before. They looked at Harold with new eyes, seeing not a frail old man, but a hero who had saved their leader's father. But somewhere along the way, Steele admitted, looking ashamed, "We lost sight of what Dad wanted this club to be. We became the kind of people he would have been disappointed in." He turned to face his club members, especially the younger ones who had harassed Harold. "We've dishonored everything my father stood for." Razor stepped forward, his usual swagger gone. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for what we did to you. We had no right, no excuse." Snake nodded beside him, unable to speak but clearly sharing the sentiment. Harold looked around the room at the faces of these tough men who now looked like ashamed schoolboys. He remembered how young the soldiers had been on Omaha Beach, how scared they all were beneath their brave faces. These bikers weren't so different. "Your father never gave up," Harold said to Steele, his voice gentle but firm. "Even when he was badly wounded, he kept fighting to live. He knew what was important, not being tough, but being there for others. That's real strength." Steele straightened up, squaring his shoulders as he made a decision. From this day forward, he announced to his club, "The Dead Ravens are going to change. We're going back to what my father wanted. A brotherhood that helps people, not bullies them." The transformation that began in that moment would spread far beyond the walls of the clubhouse, touching not just the dead ravens, but the entire community of Pine Grove. And it all started because one brave old veteran chose to face his tormentors with kindness instead of fear. The changes in Pine Grove happened so quickly that people could hardly believe their eyes. The morning after Harold's visit to the Dead Ravens clubhouse, 3 motorcycles pulled up outside his house at exactly 7:30 a.m. Steele Morrison himself, along with 2 other senior club members, had come to escort Harold to Joe's diner. At first, the sight of bikers outside Harold's house made the neighbors nervous. Mrs. Chen peeked anxiously through her curtains, and Mr. Rodriguez stepped outside his grocery store, ready to call the police. But then they saw Harold emerge from his house, smiling, as Steele respectfully offered him a clean, black leather jacket with the Dead Raven's symbol on the back. "We had this made specially for you," Steele explained, helping Harold put it on. "You're an honorary member now, the most respected one in our club." The jacket fit perfectly, and Harold wore it proudly over his usual neat shirt and tie. Together, they walked to Joe's diner, the bikers matching their pace to Harold's careful steps. Sally nearly dropped her coffee pot again, but this time from happiness, when she saw Harold enter the diner with his new escorts. The other customers watched in amazement as Steele and his men helped Harold to his usual booth, then respectfully asked if they could join him for breakfast. Within a week, the Dead Ravens had completely changed their ways. The younger members, including Razor and Snake, now spent their mornings listening to Harold's stories about World War II. They sat in Joe's diner, hanging on every word as Harold described not just the battles, but the importance of brotherhood, honor, and helping others. In war, Harold would tell them, you learn that the tough guy act doesn't mean anything. What matters is being there for each other, just like your founder, James Morrison, understood. The bikers would nod, understanding now what their club was really meant to be about. The clubhouse itself was transformed. The members cleaned up the outside, planted flowers in memory of James Morrison, and hung a new sign that read Dead Ravens MC, Brothers Helping Brothers. Inside, they created a special corner dedicated to veterans, with Harold's photograph of saving James Morrison given the place of honor. But the biggest change was in how the Dead Ravens treated the community. They started helping older residents with home repairs and yard work. Snake, who turned out to be good with computers, began teaching free classes for seniors at the local library. Razor used his mechanical skills to fix bikes for neighborhood kids. Every morning, different club members would take turns walking with Harold to the diner. They learned to appreciate his slow, steady pace, understanding that it represented the kind of patience and determination that had saved James Morrison's life on Omaha Beach. The conversations during these walks became a cherished tradition, with Harold sharing wisdom and the bikers sharing their own life stories. The Wilson kids, who had once been scared of the bikers, now waved happily when the Dead Ravens passed by. Mrs. Chen started bringing homemade cookies to the clubhouse, and Mr. Rodriguez offered discounts to club members at his grocery store. The whole atmosphere of the street had changed from fear to friendship. Harold's daughter Sarah couldn't believe the change when she came for her weekly visit. Instead of finding her father worried and stressed, she found him surrounded by new friends who treated him like family. The leather jacket hung proudly in his closet next to his military uniform, symbols of two different kinds of brotherhood. The Dead Ravens started a new tradition of celebrating veterans in their community. They'd organized motorcycle escorts for military funerals, collected donations for veterans' charities, and helped veterans' families with whatever they needed. Steele made sure that every club member understood that this was what his father had always wanted, a brotherhood dedicated to helping others. As summer turned to fall, the sight of tough bikers helping little old ladies across the street became normal in Pine Grove, and at the center of it all was Harold Thompson, the brave veteran who had shown that the greatest strength comes not from intimidation, but from kindness and understanding. On a crisp October morning, 6 months after Harold's brave decision to walk into the Dead Ravens clubhouse, Pine Grove was buzzing with excitement. The town square had been transformed with red, white, and blue decorations, and a large banner read Happy 94th Birthday, Harold Thompson, Hero of Pine Grove. The celebration was the Dead Ravens' idea. They had spent weeks planning it, wanting to show Harold how much he meant to them and the whole community. More than 300 people gathered in the square, including veterans from all over Montana who had heard about how Harold's story had changed the motorcycle club. Steele Morrison stood on a small stage, his voice carrying across the crowd as he spoke. 6 months ago, we were lost, he said, looking at his fellow club members. We had forgotten what my father started this club for. But Harold Thompson didn't just remind us. He showed us by example. He faced our bullying with courage and kindness, just like he faced danger on Omaha Beach. The Dead Ravens had become known throughout the state for their veteran support program, which they named Operation Harold. They helped veterans with home repairs, provided transportation to medical appointments, and organized support groups. What started as a small local effort had grown to help hundreds of former service members across Montana. Harold sat in a comfortable chair on the stage, wearing his Dead Ravens leather jacket over his best suit. His Silver Star medal shone on his chest, next to a new medal the town council had created to honor his contribution to the community. His daughter Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand and wiping happy tears from her eyes. My dad always said that one person's courage can change many lives, Steele continued. The medic who saved him on D-Day changed our family forever. Now Harold has changed all of us, showing that it's never too late to make a difference. Razor and Snake, who had once been Harold's tormentors, now stood proudly in their cleaned-up Dead Ravens uniforms. They had become leaders in the Veteran Support Program, with Razor organizing motorcycle escorts for military funerals and Snake running the club's social media accounts to connect with veterans in need. The clubhouse across from Joe's Diner looked completely different now. The once intimidating building had become a community center, with one room dedicated as a veterans' meeting space. The walls were covered with military photos and memorabilia, including the picture of Harold saving James Morrison, which had been professionally restored and framed. Sally from Joe's Diner brought out a huge birthday cake decorated with both the Dead Ravens logo and military medals made of frosting. As everyone sang Happy Birthday, Harold looked around at the faces of his new family, the tough bikers who had become gentle protectors, the townspeople who had overcome their fears, and the veterans who had found new hope through the club's programs. I never expected any of this, Harold said when it was his turn to speak. His voice was soft but clear, and everyone leaned in to listen. On that rainy day when my cap fell in the puddle, I thought I had lost something precious. Instead, I found a new family and a new purpose. James Morrison's spirit lives on in what the Dead Ravens have become. The celebration lasted all day, with stories being shared, friendships being strengthened, and new connections being made. Children played safely in the street while bikers helped serve food and elderly veterans shared war stories with young club members. The transformation of Pine Grove was complete. As the sun began to set, Steele presented Harold with one final gift, a new veteran's cap, custom-made with both his military honors and the Dead Ravens emblem. But this time, the cap wasn't just a symbol of past heroism, it represented something new. The bridge Harold had built between two different worlds, and the power of one person's courage to bring out the best in others. The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the motorcycle club became a legend in Montana, passed down as an example of how it's never too late to make a difference, and how true strength comes not from intimidation, but from the courage to reach out to others with kindness and understanding.